Hi there, and welcome to the third installment of the Brigport Dagger development log. In today's video, we're going to be covering the development of projectiles. There are currently two projectiles in the game, aimed and non-aimed. Non-aimed projectiles are the simpler of the two, and travel out at a roughly set distance from the player determined by the speed of the projectile. I say roughly because the projectile will inherit the player's trajectory, and some randomness is added to the trajectory of the projectile through an inaccuracy float value. By going to the broadside, we can see these projectiles fire out from the player, following their trajectory before dropping behind slightly, as well as spreading out a little bit as they reach their impact point in the water. The projectiles we're seeing fire here are at the maximum accuracy setting, but we can see how inaccuracy as well as inherited velocity are added by going into the blueprint for the projectile. We can see three sections to the blueprint, some set up at begin play at the top, the change in projectile movement over time through event tick here, and finally the impact event at the bottom. So starting at the top, I wanted to make the blueprint do a few things to decrease accuracy with a single float input to make sure the system was simple to use to build different ammo types later in the project. With this in mind, we see projectile inaccuracy determines the speed that inaccuracy is applied, as well as the potential spread of the projectile in a cone calculated here and applied to its movement through a vector. At the end here, we can see a cast to the player to get their velocity so it can be applied to the projectile. Once the projectile is in the world, the velocity inherited from the player is interpolated down to nothing as it travels through the world. Inaccuracy is increased through this interpolation here along the x and y coordinates while the projectile is in the air to reduce the predictability of the projectile at longer range without the potential to massively increase its range that increasing the inaccuracy along the z-axis would introduce. Finally, we can see the inherited velocity and inaccuracy vector applied to the projectile movement, as well as a slight boost to the z-axis to provide a decent firing arc that increases the range without lobbing shots over the enemy. To see all of this in action, we can return to the level in play, but we'll just up the inaccuracy to 10 to see the difference. So now we can see a much greater spread of our projectiles, which will make this weapon harder to use against single targets at a long range, but possibly better at taking out multiple targets who are more spread out. Going back to the editor, we can boost the inaccuracy even further to simulate different types of ammunition. With inaccuracy values above 10, we begin to see projectile behavior more like a shotgun with the broadside, allowing us to easily implement things like blunderbusses or grape shot using the same base projectile. Here we can see a huge spread to the projectile, which totally changes the way the broadside functions. Moving on to the next ammo type, we have aimed ammo. As we can see here, aimed ammo follows a trajectory towards the player's mouse location at the point of firing. It will land in the sea close to the click position of the mouse, however with inaccuracy, which is increasingly applied as the distance travelled before impact increases, up to a maximum value at max range, indicated by the changing colour of the debug sphere here. Beyond this point, the projectile will simply land in the sea at its max range and no further, with maximum inaccuracy applied. Note here the increased spread of impact points at max range when compared to projectiles fired closer to the player. To simplify player aiming in the heat of combat, when the player is aiming at an enemy, projectiles will predict enemy movement and adjust their trajectory to where the enemy is heading. So all the player need do is fire directly at an enemy, and they can be sure that if the enemy doesn't change their pathway, they should still hit it. This ties into the different intended purposes of the two ammo types, with aimed ammo intended for more precision shooting through the use of swivel guns, and broadsides using powerful yet imprecise non-aimed ammo. Going back to the blueprints, we can see how this projectile behavior is accomplished. When the projectile is spawned, a line trace is performed to find the player aim location, and it checks to see if an enemy has been hit and how far away that enemy is from the player, as well as recording its object reference. Following this, the weapon class firing the projectile is obtained through the getActor of class node. It's important to note that this will be replaced with an array with time. However, for now, this serves its purpose in developing the blueprint. It won't stay like this for long, though, as I know how inefficient this is. From here, we apply the weapon range and inaccuracy with the projectile's own range and inaccuracy stats to get the combined value for both. An inaccuracy vector is then generated by applying random floats within an increasing fractions of the final inaccuracy up until full inaccuracy at max range. Combining this new inaccuracy vector with the vector found by our earlier line trace provides a random vector around the aim location for the projectile to travel to, using the suggest projectile velocity node. If we're out of range, the direction of the shot is determined, normalizing the difference between the aim location and the player's location, and choosing the point at max range in that vector's direction. If we shoot at an enemy, we make a quick cast to the enemy we're aiming at to get their velocity, which we use to see the time it will take for the projectile to intercept with their path, and use this to determine the hit location of the projectile, with just a little boost to the z-axis to strike the ship and not the water where we're clicking. And don't forget, we're still adding an inaccuracy vector, and so the location player is shooting at might not be where the projectile hits. When the projectile does hit a target, and this is mostly the same for both projectiles currently, we can see that at first it checks to see if the target is valid. With so many projectiles flying around, it's entirely possible for the projectile to strike an enemy in the same frame it has already been destroyed, and so this just ensures that enemy destruction runs smoothly. Invalid hits result in the projectile being deleted to prevent unusual ricochets off nothing, but projectiles can ricochet off each other, and this will result in a sound being played. Although the sound isn't played for unaimed projectiles due to the volume of them that can be spawned at any given time with broadsides. If the projectile hits the floor, a miss is logged and the projectile is destroyed with an appropriate sound and particle effect. Should it hit an enemy, the correct damage is applied along with destruction of the projectile and yet another appropriate sound and particle effect. So here we can see all these systems in action as the player sails around, sinking enemies and generally swashbuckling their way through the game. We can see the range of our two aimed weapons through different coloured spheres, allowing the player to quickly see what's going on with their weapons as they focus on the task at hand with minimal complication. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you join me next week for some enemies.